Hello everyone on this call. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to all of you to the LSE virtually this time. My name is Piroska Nagy Mohacsi, and I'm the Academic Program Director at the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics School of Public Policy. This is now the 14th event that we host under our LSE series on COVID crisis management, crisis response. We started back in March, looks like ages ago, when at some important parts of the corners of the world, maybe the UK, maybe the US, policymakers still were downplaying the severity of the pandemics. But that was then, and here we are. And I'm very pleased to see many returning customers of ours to this series, but also the newcomers who are joining us for the very first time. This event today, we are co-organizing together with the European Institute at the LSE and the LSE School of Public Policy. And today, we are very pleased to welcome to our series Professor Thomas Philippon. He is the Max Hein Professor of Finance at the New York University Stern School of Business. He was named the top 25 economist under 45 by the IMF just a few years ago. He won the 2013 Bernanke Prize for the best European economist under 40, and he has other major awards under his belt, such as the Michael Brennan and BlackRock Award, to name another one. He is an academic advisor to the Finance Stability Board. Finally, just to, for the record, he graduated from École Polytechnique and he received his PhD in economics from MIT. He is well known for his work on the Eurozone crisis, financial regulation, financial resolution mechanisms, and of course, the market power of large firms. And this is what brings him today to LSE, to this series. He's presenting his new book, The Great Reversal, How America Gave Up on Free Markets. Not to preempt what he's going to say, but he will be focusing on the importance of the concentration of corporate power and market power as a major problem, as a key problem of the American economy. Meanwhile, he informs us that actually Europe has become more competitive over the years, so to speak, beating the US at its own game. So let's hear about that. And let's hear also about how these important trends that he has identified and puts out in his book has been affected, or to what extent been perhaps changed and challenged by the ongoing COVID crisis. After Professor Philippon, we will hear from our own Dr. Angelo Martelli. He's from the LSE, Assistant Professor in the European and International Political Economy at the European Institute of the LSE. Angelo will provide comments looking particularly at these issues from the European angle. Angelo received his PhD from the LSE, and he is one of our rising stars. Just a few housekeeping matters. Number one, Twitter users, please use the hashtag for today's event as for the series, hashtag LSE COVID-19. Number two, this online event is being recorded and will be made available, barring any technical difficulties, we hope none. So it will be posted, and it is also being live streamed on Facebook. And third, as usual, with our series, there will be a chance for you to put your own questions to our speakers. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, although in my screen actually is at the top, so please just find it and put your question. This will be compiled by a very capable team of Caro and Jerry and submitted to me, and I will transmit them to our speakers. Please let us know your name and affiliation. We are very eager to hear from our alumni, from our students, including incoming students, and of course our usual viewers. But enough of the housekeeping matters. We are all excited, and I'm delighted to hand it over to Professor Philippon.
Well, thank you very much. I wish I could be in London with you. It's always a great pleasure to come to London and see many friends there. So I was looking forward to this book tour in the UK, but unfortunately we're going to do this book tour online. I hope it's okay for everybody. So thank you all for joining, and let me give you a quick overview of the book, and then we can have a discussion. So first, the title. Why did I call that book The Great Reversal? It's because it corresponds to my own experience coming to the US. I grew up in France, as you can tell from my accent, and then I spent 1 year at the LSE before going to MIT. And I was struck when I arrived in Boston for my PhD that many of the goods and services that, especially the ones that I valued as a student, that is buying a laptop computer, having access to internet, being able to travel to conferences via airplanes, all of these things were actually cheaper in the US than in Europe, and oftentimes much cheaper. And this is surprising, of course, because the US was, and still is, about 20% richer on a per capita basis than Europe. And therefore, because of the Balassa-Samuelson effect, you would expect non-traded goods and services to be more expensive in the US, not cheaper. So clearly something different was happening. And of course, what was happening is that these industries were more competitive. The consumers got a better deal because the market was working better, because firms were competing harder by lowering their price and offering good quality product. So this is the US that I discovered around 1999. 20 years later, much to my surprise, things have reversed. Many of these, in fact, all of the goods that I listed so far, which is telecom and transportation, have become cheaper in Europe than in the US. And I don't mean cheaper by 5%. I mean cheaper by half. So this is an example. This is the cost of broadband internet access. That's what we are all using right now to be on this Zoom call, right? We are all connected. I guess I suppose some of you could be connected from your iPhones via wireless, but most of us, I assume, are connected via home or office via broadband. This is what we pay per month for this connection. Essentially, every developed economy in the world is in the $30 to $40 per month range. And this is for the same quality, that is for the same speed, okay? And the US is twice that price, okay? This is, what that means is it's not just that Europe has caught up with the US, it's that the US has fallen behind in terms of having a good deal for consumers, okay? Now you might say, wait a minute, that's just one industry. In fact, it's one subset of the industry. Is that true more generally? So let's look at the telecom industry in general. This is the evolution of the telecom industry in the US since 1990. So you have the markup and the concentration ratio. The markup is just essentially the profit margins per unit of revenue. And the concentration ratio is the top 8 firm market share. And these are all in changes, okay? So what you see is the markup went up by something like 40% since 2000. This here is the sweet spot, is exactly when I arrived in the US. So that's why I was so impressed, because that's where I was at the low point in terms of concentration and prices. Since then, it's been drifting in the wrong direction with more concentration and higher prices and higher margins. And these changes are very large. Okay, the CR8 moved by 40 points. Okay, so that's a very large change. Now, this very large change is a little bit specific to that industry. If you look at the entire corporate sector in the US, like this, you see the same broad pattern, but of course the magnitudes are somewhat smaller. So this is the profit margin divided by value added, or GDP, for the non-financial corporates. Very happy to talk about finance in the Q&A, but for much of the talk, I'm not going to spend too much time on finance because the accounting issues are a bit different there, so I don't want to mix up finance and non-finance firms. So for now, let's just focus on the real economy. So as you can see, the profit margin of businesses tended to fluctuate around 7% for much of the post-war period. Of course, it moves around because typically when there's a recession, profits drop. So you can see the recession of 1980, 1990, the internet bubble collapse. Every time there is a big recession, profits fall, typically more than GDP, and therefore the margin falls. But it was fluctuating around some average of 7%. Today, it's still fluctuating. This drop here is the drop during the Great Recession. Of course, we're going to have another one here in the COVID crisis. But the fluctuation happened around a higher mean of around 10%. So what we saw in telecom is not that surprising. In terms of concentration, you can try to replicate the same kind of computation. So CR8 for the entire private sector. It gets tricky because we don't always have the correct level of granularity to look at all the market. So this is a bit too aggregated. But you can see the broad patterns are very similar, which is somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000, concentration starts to go up in many industries. And it's particularly strong in the non-manufacturing sector. I think it's really mostly an issue of non-manufacturing. In manufacturing, not only the increase is relatively smaller because it started from a higher baseline, so in relative terms it's increased less, but also it's also driven by global trade. To give you a sense of the magnitude, so here the CR8 went up by what, 8 points for the non-manufacturing, starting from a baseline of around 20%. So say you move from 20 to 28. On average for the corporate sector as a whole, the increase is about 25%. So that means if you had, say, 4 main firms in a market competing before, now you're down to 3 on average, okay, to give you a sense of the weight. So it's not that every firm has disappeared, but it's that there is meaningful concentration. There is a little bit of controversy about exactly how you define these measures, but I think the broad pattern is clear. What is very controversial, on the other hand, is the interpretation of the fact. Okay, so it is not at all obvious what you should conclude from these figures. And to frame the debate, I find it useful to classify the explanations into groups: good versus bad concentration. Good concentration happens when the market leaders become even better. Okay, so they were already pretty good. They already had high market shares. That's why they were the leaders. And then they just got even better. Okay, so when that happens, clearly their market shares are going to go up. You're going to see an increase in concentration. But it's not something you need to worry about, at least probably not, because it's driven by the fact that they just got better. Okay, so typically when you see that, this kind of concentration is going to come together with high productivity growth. Okay, that's the leaders getting better. Low prices, because they're going to keep competing, at least among each other. Typically, although maybe it was not always like that, but in recent years, it's almost always like that, this kind of evolution almost always comes together with a lot of investment in intangible assets. Okay, so when we say intangible assets in economics, we mean things that are not machines, plants, and equipment. Okay, so this is IT, patents, property rights, intellectual capital in general. Okay, so most of the successful firms of the past 30 years have been successful because they've been really good at using intangible assets. Okay. So you see then this cluster of high productivity, low prices, lots of intangible investments, and it sometimes, you could even argue, oftentimes come together with higher concentration. But you should not be worried too much about that. Okay, that's the good concentration. The bad concentration is when the increasing market share of the big firms is driven by the fact that they successfully manage to exclude competitors. Okay, so they raise barriers to entry. And these barriers typically could be regulatory, so they could make sure that nobody gets a license. That's a sure way to not have competition. Usually to do that, you need to lobby the regulator to make sure they don't give license to somebody who would compete with you. So that's one type of barrier to entry. The other extreme, if you don't like the new up-and-coming competitor, just buy it. Just buy it, make an acquisition, and then be done with it. Okay. So, and then everything in between. Okay, very aggressive sales tactic, aggressive behavior to just kill the entrance before they can enter. All of that happens. These would be barriers to entry. And then you would see high concentration, but you wouldn't see the good side of it. You wouldn't see the high price, you wouldn't see the low price and the high productivity. In fact, typically you would see higher prices and lower productivity growth, okay? Now, if you think about the US today, it's pretty clear that sectors such as retail and wholesale trade fit very well the good concentration story. And then sectors like telecom, airlines, and healthcare fit very well the bad concentration story. So the question is more, okay, on average, for everything in the middle, is it more grayish to the black side or grayish to the white side? Is it, more good or bad concentration? It's going to be a mix of the two. The only interesting question is to tease out on average, which one is more important. Once we understand that, we can talk about technology and policy as explanation for what's going on. Okay, so just to frame the debate, let's start with one example of good concentration. That's the expansion of Walmart since the 1980s. So the market share of Walmart is on the right axis from 0 to 60%. It's not a typo, it's 60%. That is, one company has 60% of the market. The market here is the market for big box retailers, okay? And notice that does not include online retailers, which is going to be important. So this is the traditional supermarkets, okay, or hypermarkets. Now, this is the expansion of Walmart. So I think I have never seen something like that. It's just amazing. You go from 0 to 60% of the market. You have 1 million employees. But notice that the profit margin of Walmart in green, if anything, you would argue, is slightly going down over this period, or it's definitely not going up, okay? What that means is that all the productivity gains that Walmart successfully achieved in the 1980s and 90s were passed on one for one as lower prices to consumers. Okay, that's why their profit margin was stable. Okay, so the way Walmart achieved this dominance was by doing a lot of IT investment. Okay, so just-in-time inventory management, a lot of software, a lot of high-tech high-tech systems to manage their inventories and the inventories of their suppliers. That gave them a comparative advantage. They started to expand by cutting prices. Okay, so this is what we call good concentration. And just to be clear, good concentration, very competitive, cutthroat capitalism if you want. It doesn't mean it's not controversial. Typically, it is controversial. In fact, it should be. So you can argue about labor practices in Walmart. You can argue about the fact that maybe they put too many small stores out of business. And maybe that's bad for the communities. That's all perfectly fair. There's an interesting debate to be had. But at some basic level, at the very least, we can say they innovate, they grow, and consumers get a good deal. Okay, so when I see that, I call that good concentration. The other thing that's fascinating about that example is that what happens at the end. Start to plateau. And what's interesting is around 2005, so mid-2000, Walmart has this massive dominance position. And people start to worry about it and say, well, maybe we need to do something. We need to curtail their growth. And we do. For instance, we deny a banking license, which is crazy. Walmart should have got a banking license. The reason they didn't get it is because the banks lobbied against it and because it was already too big and too scary. Okay, but the great thing about capitalism is, in theory, the market should be solving that problem. Because if you think they become too big and too successful, then somebody is going to notice and start competing with them. And oftentimes, we don't see it coming because it's coming from somewhere we didn't forecast. In that particular case, it did not come from within the industry. So the market share of Walmart, which was 60% of the supermarket, did not get attacked by another supermarket. It got attacked by, of course, Amazon, which was an online retailer. And today, they are fiercely competing, these two. And I don't think there is an issue of high prices in that sector. Okay, you might have other issues, but definitely not high prices. So that's the success story. To me, that looks like good concentration. And the question becomes, can you see that in the data today? Okay, so in the book, I go through great lengths to look at all indicators one by one, but let me give you the big picture summary. So suppose you create two clusters of data when you look at industries. One cluster has lots of intangible investment, strong productivity growth, and declining prices. The other cluster has no entry of new firms, no investment in IT, and relatively slow productivity growth and prices. Well, it turns out first that these two clusters actually describe the data pretty well. Or in other words, if you run a principal component analysis across industries, you're going to find that they load naturally on these two types of activities. Okay, so that's why I called one intangible and the other one barriers to entry. So the intangible cluster looks like the good concentration. And as you can see in our estimation, it's kind of flat. So we are not saying it's disappeared. We're not saying today there is no industry that goes through some kind of efficient concentration, but it's flat, okay? But the other cluster, the one that looks more like barriers to entry, has become relatively more important. Okay, so its score has increased over time. So the main gist of the argument of the book is that we have too much of the bad concentration and too little of the good one today compared to 20 years ago. Once we understand that, then the next questions are, first, why? Is it technology that's driving that somewhere? Or can we trace it back to differences in or changes in policy decisions? Okay, so technology versus policy. And once we understand that, we can ask the next question, which is why did it happen the way it did? And if you want to really make progress on this question, I think you need some sort of control group. So you need another place where technology is the same and policy is different. And that's where Europe fits in the big picture. So for the next 5 slides, I'm going to assume a way, I'm going to remove the high-tech firms from the sample. Okay, so I'm not looking at Google or Amazon or Facebook simply because they do not have a European counterpart that I could compare with. And I'm going to look at everything else. Okay, and if you think about everything else, quickly you realize that we drive the same car, we have the same cell phone, we fly the same airplanes, we have the same airport. Everything is the same. Okay, we use precisely the same technology as the Americans. Why? Well, for the simple reason that technology flies across borders. And so that is a reason why we use the same technology, because we share it. So therefore, if you see large differences, you know it's not going to be driven by technology. Now, do we see big differences? And the answer is yes, because in Europe, starting in the mid-2000s, mid-90s, we have a wave of product market deregulations. Okay, so PMR is product market regulations, and these are the reforms at the EU level. And this is just counting the number of reforms per country per year. So one means there is one major reform per country per year on average for a period of about 10 to 15 years. Okay. The timing is not random, obviously. It happens after we start a single market, as I will explain. And it's significant. That's a lot of reforms if you add them up. So let me give you one example of one of these reforms that is going to make it more concrete. This is the telecom industry in France. So France used to have 3 legacy carriers. Okay, so if you wanted to have a cell phone, you had the choice between 3 firms, and it was a classic oligopoly that did not compete on price. They had found a way to stabilize, the competition. So they were all offering the same product for the same price and had been doing so for a long time. And there was a 4th firm that wanted to enter this market, but to enter in this market, to become a wireless carrier, you need a license and you need a spectrum. And the 3 legacy carriers were lobbying very hard to deny the license to the new entrant. And then in 2011, they lost, and Free Mobile entered the French market. And they entered at half the price of the incumbent. Okay, they didn't do like 5% or 10%. They did 50%, right? So just to give you a sense, so it's 2011. So this is before like fully unlimited data. So it's like unlimited texting plus like a bunch of megabytes of data for the typical smartphone contract. That benchmark contract was priced at 40 euros per month by Bouygues and SFR and France Telecom. And Free entered at 20 euros per month. So within 6 months, of course, they start getting market shares. The incumbent realized that something is happening and they cut their own price. So that a year or 2 later, everybody's at 20 euros. Which means not just the 5 or 10% of people who actually switched to Free, okay? Because even Free today still has a market share of less than 20%. It did not become the dominant firm, okay? It forced everybody else to lower their prices, which means my parents, who are not tech savvy and kept the same phone, are paying, and they have an amazing deal on their cell phone. In fact, they have a combined deal with their broadband, so they pay a quarter of what I pay here for me and my family. But they didn't have to do anything. They kept the same exact provider as before. Competition came to them. You can see it in this price series, which is the price of communication in France. So this is data from the World Bank, from the ICP data, so International Comparison of Prices. That's the data we use when we make a comparison of GDP per capita on a PPP basis around the world. Okay, so these are the underlying data to make the price adjustments. And it's a bit too aggregated. So communication includes much more than just wireless services. So a lot of other stuff was going on at the same time. But the thing is, the change was so big that you see it anyway. We were about 10 to 15% more expensive than the US, and we became 25% cheaper in 2 years. Okay, and today we are 40% cheaper. So this is not a small industry, right? This is the entire communication service sector. And the relative price moved by 40%. So this is something you notice, right? It's not like a little bit of a wiggle somewhere in a time series. It's a massive change. If you look at over time, all these regulations, you see a pattern like that, okay? So now we go back, we zoom out, we look at the entire EU. So every green dot is one country in the EU. The red line is the US. And this is the OECD PMR index. So what they do for this is they look at a bunch of indicators that measure restrictions to competition, like barriers to entry, licensing requirement, all kinds of restrictions to competition. And it has 4 dimensions and just add them up. So the worst score would be 4, the best score would be 0. 4 means that everything is cartelized, and then 0 means there is no restriction whatsoever. As you can see, no country in Europe had a tradition of free market. Everybody had more restriction than the US in the 1990s, okay? With one exception. And of course, I'm sure you can guess what this green dot is, because that's the country you live in, okay? Obviously, the one exception is the one country in Europe that had a traditional free market was the UK. So the UK is here, but everybody else is above, okay? And then from one vintage of data to the next, you don't see much change, okay? Which is why people kept in the back of their mind the idea that, well, the US is the place where markets are competitive and Europe is the place, this backward place where markets are not competitive. And of course, it drifts slowly, but since it always drifts in the same direction, 20 years later, the drift has happened. So today, you would argue that all countries in Europe are about the same as the US. In fact, many of them are actually have lower barriers to entry. You can see it in prices. And one way to look at it is the price relative to unit labor cost. So that's another way of approximating something like a markup. And this is the price minus unit labor cost in the US in red versus EU 10. EU 10 because I only have 10 countries big enough to have correct measures. Essentially, there is no trend in Europe. It's kind of flat. This decrease here is mostly the EU crisis. I think it's back up to something flat now. But in the US, there is a clear trend upward. Okay. And this is, again, for like the same industry. So this is industry by industry comparison, then you take the average of that. Okay, so it's not driven by changes in technology or industry composition or whatever. So the difference is about 7–10%. I think the EU has become more competitive over time and the US less. So my own, back of the envelope estimate is that the US markups have increased over 20 years by something like 7 points. So to translate that into numbers that everybody can understand, it means that the median household in the US is getting taxed $300 per month by monopoly rents. Okay? They're paying $300 per month extra. They should get another $300 in their pocket at the end of each month if the market had remained competitive. If you aggregate that across all the households in the US in over 12 months, you get $600 billion. Okay, that's the impact on consumer spending. There's $600 billion of consumer spending each year, which is pure rent to monopolies. Now, you can then ask a more interesting question, which is, suppose we could dial back the clock to go back to the 2000 when I got there and markets were competitive. What would happen? Well, that's a totally standard microeconomic simulation. So the answer is GDP would go up by 1 trillion. I should say private GDP. This is for the private sector, not, of course, the government. I don't know what the government would do. So for the private sector, GDP would go up by about $1 trillion, which is 5%, because private GDP is something like 20 trillion. So there would be you would increase the pie by $1 trillion. And on top of it, you would have some redistribution, because if you lower prices, you lower profit margins. Now, of course, the business would sell more because GDP goes up by 1 trillion. So sales, so revenues would also go up. But since profit margins shrink, the profits actually also would decrease. by about $250 billion. So what that means is that labor income would go up by more than $1 trillion, in fact, by 1.25 trillion. Okay, so if we could switch back to a competitive economy, American workers would get an extra $1.25 trillion in their pocket every year. That is a lot of money. Okay. For the median household, it's about a 10% increase in its income, okay, real income. Because the median household gets most of its income from labor. You know, their capital income is relatively small. So the decrease in capital income by 250 billion doesn't hit them very hard, but the increase in labor income helps them a lot. So typically for the median household, which earns something like $50,000 per year, that would be like an extra $5,000 per year, okay, 10%. So that's a very significant improvement in their standards of living. Okay, so then if it's so good, if competition is so great, what happened? Why is it that it disappeared? Or disappeared is too strong. Why is it that it decreased? And what can be done? So there I want to be completely honest with you. I think I have a complete story for what happened in Europe. I think I'm pretty confident that I know what happened in Europe. I don't have the same level of confidence in what happened in the US. It's more complicated. So let me tell you the European story, and then we can brainstorm about the American one. The European story is the kind of thing that we like as economists, because it sounds like a paradox, but when you write down the model, the equation comes out perfectly. So it's the paradox is the following. As we saw earlier, there is no country in Europe that has a tradition of free market, except for the UK. So you put 20 countries like that, like Italy, France, Germany, around the table, and none of them has a tradition of free market. None of them has a tradition of strong and independent regulators maximizing consumer welfare. That's not their tradition. And you put 20 of them around the table, and voila, instead of doing the same thing, they do something completely different. At the EU level, they build up an architecture which is super pro-competition, completely focused on consumer welfare, with the most independent regulators in the world. How is that possible? Why did they decide together to do the opposite of what they were doing at home for like a century? So that's the paradox. But of course, what's great is if you actually write the game, that's the new national equilibrium. It's because the same politicians that like to have industrial policy and their national champions at home understand that if they play that game at the EU level, everybody will be trying to influence the regulators. And sometimes you're going to lose. Sometimes the other countries are going to capture the regulator and do something which is not good for you. So then if you understand that game, you realize that your best strategy is to commit to have a fully independent regulator. You lose the chance to influence the regulator, but you gain security that nobody else is going to use the regulator against you. Okay, this is why we have such strong and independent institutions at the EU level, even though this was not the tradition at the national level. And the timing is also very clear. It should happen exactly after we decide to have a single market. If we don't have a single market, none of that matters. If we have a single market with free trade, completely free trade and free mobility inside the EU, then we need that. Okay, I think that explains Europe. The rest is just, then it's slowly, once you set up the institutions, they have an influence and you can keep track of that influence slowly over time. That does not explain what happened in the US, because in the US, there is not a change like that. You don't have like a single market. They had a single market before and they still have it today. There is no obvious change in the data. All I can point out in the US is some proximate causes that are themselves endogenous, and I don't exactly know what changed precisely. What I do know for sure is you cannot think of what's going on in the US without thinking about lobbying. That I know for sure. But why lobbying started to increase, that I do not know. Okay, so this is lobbying expenditures in the US and the EU. The green line here is the total lobbying expenditures in the US, and the red is lobbying by businesses. The difference between the red and the green, that would be lobbying by NGOs, consumer advocacy groups, and stuff like that, non-businesses. So as you can see, the vast majority of lobbying is done by businesses, and all of the increase is by businesses. So to a first order, you can think of it as just corporate lobbying. And it's increased a lot. It's multiplied by 3. In fact, I think more than that, because the data in the recent years is crap because they stopped enforcing punishment for companies that don't report correctly. So I don't think this flattened at all. I think it kept going up, but we just don't measure it very well. So clearly a massive increase in corporate lobbying. The same happened in campaign finance contribution. If you look at the EU, we don't have, unfortunately, the same quality of data. So we cannot go back in the past as much. I can only look at the recent years. But to give you, I think the orders of magnitude sort of make sense, which is the EU today, in terms of its lobbying, look just like the US 20 years ago. So it's not zero, but it's not overwhelming. Also in Europe, interestingly, the share of lobbying which is done by non-businesses is much higher than in the US. It's actually almost of the same order of magnitude as business lobbying. And conditional on bringing a case, the lobbyists are actually less likely to win in Brussels than they are in Washington. All that speaks to the influence of lobbyists in the US and the relative independence in Europe, which is not perfect, of course, but it's definitely better than either in the US or better than it was at the country level. So I think this is the big picture of what happened in Europe and in the US. And I'd rather stop here to have more time for discussion later. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was very clear, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure we will have more questions. To our audience, please keep the questions coming. And let me now hand it over to Angelo Martelli. Angelo, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Piroska, for your kind introduction, and to Professor Philippon for giving me the chance actually to discuss his superb and actually honest account of what has happened in market concentration and market power across the two sides of the Atlantic in the last 2 decades. So I prepared a set of slides. I'll try to keep within the 10-minute time that I've
Start with my hero. You have my hero on the first slide.
Yeah, and what you will notice actually in this presentation is that I have replaced all the very good and solid evidence of the graphs with a lot of photos. So that's one big change. So what I will focus on in my presentation in particular will be, I'll try to give a bit of a different perspective on the book and more context of why I think actually the account that Professor Philippon does is actually the heart of capitalism and democracy. And then give a bit of more of an update of what is going on. So I will focus on the second part of the title for today's event, in the time of COVID, with especially a European focus. So as we have heard until now, I think, it is kind of there is indisputable evidence of a greater degree of market concentration in the US, fewer retailers, fewer cable companies, fewer airlines, therefore, in the end, fewer choices for consumers. And where there is a bit more debate, it's on whether this has translated, of course, into market power, and whether this, therefore, is in a way that to do with also greater global competition. What I think we have seen also in the presentation beforehand is that there is a lot of evidence of higher markups on prices charged to consumers as well. So why has concentration increased? There have been different hypotheses out there. Part of it can be efficiency, but of course there are a lot of artificial barriers. For instance, it may have to do with the IP laws, local regulations to start businesses, occupational licensing rules, some monopsony power. And I think what we actually see is evidence of this great reversal at its best. This is actually based on the paper by Gutierrez and Philippon 2018, and it is clear that you actually see in this gray line, for instance, is the EU at the country level, or the EU taken as an aggregate, therefore as a weighted average of the industries, and treating the EU as a single market. You actually see clear evidence that this great reversal has actually happened. This is based just on the Erfindal-Hirschman index, which is basically an index measuring market concentration by looking at market shares of all suppliers in the market. Now, in the book, what you will see is that I think it is a superb account because, first of all, Professor Philippon tells us, look, take everything with a huge grain of salt, because this is the job of what economists should actually do. So should present very solid evidence, and then it is for others, policymakers and politicians, to take, the final decision. And what he does is that he sets out a number of different hypotheses and then tries to test them. Among them, they were already mentioned. For instance, there is the rise of superstar firms, there is the hypothesis of globalization, or the hypothesis of intangible assets. One that probably, and that's where I would like also to hear Professor Philippon view, which does not really come from economics per se, but comes a bit more from geopolitics, international relations, is also the idea that it is in a way wanted by the top, by the US government, to keep a high concentration in those firms, to keep a lot of these national champions for a sort of power dominance, soft power to some extent. In a way, when you talk to businessmen across the two sides of the Atlantic, it seems always the American businessman looks at the world as the market in a way. When instead, if you talk to an Italian or a Spanish or a French businessman, to some extent, I hope I will not hurt anyone by saying this, but the market and the catchment area is always a bit smaller. So if you then move, and there is the very nice slide of that we saw before about the missing $1 trillion. I think this book is extremely a solid account, also because it tries to combine two views, one that comes more from competition economics and another one from public economics. Now, the competition economics industry looks at whether there are any competition concerns to be looked into by adopting what is called the theory of harm. And the theory of harm should be usually logically consistent, reflect the incentives that various parties face, and be in line with the available empirical evidence, and articulate how consumers have been or will be harmed. This, in a way, I think, can be combined with also the view from public economics, which is, you try to look at society with a welfare function. In one other talk, I remember Professor Philippon basically saying, this is a slide that Republicans like, this is a slide that usually Democrats like, meaning, is it, are we being business friendly or are we being consumer friendly? And in a way, it is a decision by each government or by an economic area to, strike the right balance between the two. And I think there is a lot of evidence in the book which basically hints at this balance being dearly needed and looking at two sides of the coin. Now, I think one clear winner from the book and from this account is for sure the single market and the independence of European authorities that, as you probably a lot of you know in the audience, this is coming a bit under threat in the last days with the decision of a top federal court in Germany. Of course, it doesn't have to do with the single market per se, but it might have repercussions moving forward on the institutional equilibrium that we will see onwards. So as the Great Reversal tries to show, we can clearly see and pushing competitiveness since the single market was established, in particular since 1993. And it is interesting to look at the DG competition and market advisor in currently the commissioner for that DG, actually being at the heart of the decision making and the heart of a national equilibrium, as Professor Philippon clearly explains. Something that a lot of domestic audiences, a lot of governments didn't want to do with their domestic audiences, therefore take very tough decisions about breakups of monopolies. We have managed actually to do at the European level. And this has been only possible because DG competition has had a lot of independence in the past 2 decades, and there has been a lot of willingness from the top to actually, not favor any country in particular in these last 2 decades. Now, this brings me to what is happening nowadays. Many of you, and I'm here showing excerpts from the interview that a fellow countryman of Thomas Philippon, Macron, has actually given to Financial Times in mid-April. And it's interesting because it, in a way, goes back to what I was mentioning before about the social welfare function that we would like to adopt. And also it has a lot to do with the competition economics that we will be facing in the next years. So first of all, of course, Macron describes the EU as a political project. The human factor is a priority, and there are notions of solidarities that come into play. The economy follows on from that. And let's not forget that economics is a moral science. Here, he wanted in a way to bring in the Germans on board with their concept of philosophy, also a moral philosophy. Economics as a moral philosophy. And then he goes on to say, you cannot have a single market where some are sacrificed. Yeah, it is no longer possible to have a financing that is non-mutualized for the spending we are undertaking the battle against COVID-19 and that we will have for the economic recovery. But lastly, he says, and I think like very few observers have actually highlighted this. He says, we are going to nationalize the wages and the financial accounts of almost all our businesses, Mr. Macron said. That's what we are doing. All our economies, including the most economically liberal, are doing that. It's against all the dogmas, but that's the way it is. And I think this is extremely interesting evidence to also open up then a bit the discussion of what is happening in Europe nowadays. Fortunately, DG competition is supervising this whole process of state aid the responses that have been taken at country level. I know this looks like a lot, and these are the 105 national measures that were actually adopted under this temporary framework put forward by the European Commission. Now, most of these measures, what we can see, are in terms of loans and state guarantees. Since this week, actually, there has been an amendment to this framework, which looks to actually allow some measures of recapitalization and subordinated debt measures. And this is where we have to be a bit careful, because then it's when the framework is not going to be that temporary anymore. And we have to be careful of if there is a good exit strategy in place by the governments. Otherwise, we are in front of a looming wave of new nationalization. And let me give this example of, I can't provide solid evidence of what is happening nowadays. So this is very speculative and based on my humble observation of what we have seen in the past weeks. First of all, based on what has happened at the EU level, of course, we have retrenched a bit into our national domestic arenas. And for instance, in the airline industry, we have seen, for instance, France backing up Air France, Germany Lufthansa, Italy Alitalia, and so on. And this has, of course, created major problems for other carriers that don't have so much a state backing, a strong state backing. And therefore, Ryanair has recently been filing a massive amount of complaints because it is saying, you know, I was an efficient player in the market, and all these measures are actually going in the opposite direction. So let's actually try to keep a level playing field here. This is one that, you know, we should raise a bit eyebrows of, because it is happening also in other industries. The second point is about supply chains. All of you are probably aware of the breaks in supply chains that have happened on medical supply. So I wanted to provide some kind of different evidence. And I also live in London, and the supermarkets here, at least in the first phase, saw a shortage of eggs in particular, among other items such as toilet papers and so on. But eggs, I think, is the interesting example, because I discovered actually that the carton board that where you hold the eggs only have 3 suppliers in Europe, and actually one of them, the Danish one, was shut off, and this created actually the shortage that we see there. And these hint signal of industry concentration in the food industry is actually being something that is being reported, especially in the last week, also in the US, in the case of meat, for instance. So one has to be a bit careful, because bottlenecks have been appearing in very strange places, creating a sort of domino-like effect across whole supply chains. And you know, it says a lot about the type of vertical integration that we'll be seeing in the years to come. The second structural break and the fragility is actually something that that in its absurdity hints at the fact that free markets are alive and kicking. So the Italian government, what it tried to do, it tries to cap the price of face masks at 50%. And this totally backfired because of the suppliers' unwillingness and also the vendors' unwillingness. And it should teach us a lot of, you know, of trying to, you know, going back to what I was saying before, of the right balance in the consumer surplus and also being at the same time business friendly. One has to be extremely careful of the type of government intervention that we would like to see. Then just the couple of last 2 slides, and I'm finishing here, is what has happened actually with Deliveroo. So we actually thought that, you know, food deliveries would go massively up. This has not actually been the case. Why? Because a lot of the food and restaurant industry in London has been shut down. Also the big chains such as Nando's, McDonald's, and so on. And the Deliveroo faced bankruptcy. And what the Competition Market Authority did was a bit of a reversal on the take on this, because it was before blocking, for instance, Amazon from having an investment in Deliveroo, and they now changed its position by actually saying that to protect customers and to prevent higher prices, they will allow this acquisition, this investment to go on. So one last point has to do with liquidity. One, we have to be careful, because if you talk to investment bankers, they say cash has never been so cheap, and a lot of big tech and also pharma companies have a lot of liquidities, and these can potentially bring to a lot more concentration in the future. And so to finish on this, how how will our post-pandemic future look like? It's a bit of a big question mark. However, one can see that regulators' priorities are definitely changing. This is the case in the EU and the UK. We have to be careful of, type of vertical integration that we will be seeing. Big tech will certainly come under intense scrutiny because of the data privacy issues and taxes. And finally, we have to be also, if you look at it from the labor market standpoint, one has to also think about the increasing precariousness and deregulation on that front. So thank you very much, and I yield the floor back to Piroska.
Thank you very much, Angelo. I want to ask Professor Philippon if he has any urgency to address any of the points that Angelo has raised. If not, then maybe we should turn to the questions and answers. The questions are pouring in, and I'm mindful of the time that we have left.
I think it's more fun for everybody if we go for the questions.
Very good. Very much agree.
Thank you, Angelo, for your great discussion, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points in the Q&A.
Perfect.
Great, very good. So let's turn to the questions, very nicely flowing in, very pertinent. Many relate to the question of the impact of COVID and the rising nationalism. William Claxton Smith asks whether with the ongoing global pressures for national efficiency, more national efficiency, particularly under the COVID crisis, will we see an acceleration of trends in the US and the reverse of the good ones in Europe, in your view? So how does the COVID and this urgency, the perception of more national efficiency, the pressure for that affects the trends that you describe? And maybe I can add one more, and that is one more kind of impact. What's the impact of Brexit, if any? When we are sitting, most of us in London, and given that you mentioned that the UK was the only true free market before the whole product market reforms got underway in the EU, and has been indeed was sadly now in past tense, was a major engine of competition policy, and now has left. What that would mean for the trends that you described in Europe?
You want me to do the Brexit first, perhaps, or two different questions?
Choice. Yes.
Well, so Brexit was, of course, a major shock. And in the context of the EU, I think it's in the bigger picture of whether we think of, Europe as being temporarily more consumer friendly, or whether Europe has had a structural break that is not going to reverse itself. So it's a discussion I've had many times with Luigi Zingales, for instance, who says, well, maybe what's happening is we just did it 10 years after the Americans. So right now we still have, relatively competitive markets, but quickly enough, these oligopolies are going to find a way to bring back their rents. And we're just going to converge back to where we are. And the alternative is that, no, we did something different, it's going to stay different. I'm more in the second camp because I think it's the right interpretation of the EU is once you enshrine something in the institutions, it's very hard to change. And I think the DNA of the single market is that it is pro-consumers. And that is in part thanks to the UK, because at the time where, of course, the institutions were designed, the UK was very much a member and a very influential one at that. And so the UK has given Europe some of its best ideas in terms of free markets. And I don't think they're going to go away because they are now enshrined in the EU institutions. Short of a treaty change, which nobody wants and nobody can achieve anyway, I don't think that's going to change. So I am relatively optimistic in that sense. I am worried about one big factor, which is China. And I'll come back to that when we talk about the COVID part. But I think otherwise, you can make the case that EU students are here to stay like that. I think the same is true for the ECB. Now, COVID is gonna, of course, that has many impacts. I think it's useful to think about, the first thing it's gonna do is gonna kill a bunch of small firms, okay? The small firms are gonna die at a faster rate than the big firms, because the small firms have lower liquidity on hand when at the beginning, usually. They have less ability to access liquidity during the crisis because they can only rely on banks, while the big firms can rely on financial markets. They can tap commercial paper, bond markets, and in this market, say the commercial paper or the bond market, the central bank can intervene directly, very efficiently. So while again, the smaller firms need to rely on the banks, so that gives another advantage to the big ones. And finally, the big ones are very good at getting bailouts. Okay, and we saw that with Lufthansa and Air France. Okay, so that is clearly something that's going to be bad for small firms and good for the big ones, relatively speaking. And EasyJet and Ryanair do have a case to complain about. And I'm not too worried about them, to be honest, because their margins were significantly higher. They're just so much more efficient than the big legacy carriers that I don't think they're going to die. You know, I think they're fine. But in the grand scheme of things, they are right to complain. So the first thing is going to be that's reshuffling because the smaller firms are more vulnerable to the crisis. Then the second thing is going to be the impact of doing everything online, obviously, like this, okay? And this is going to be a double-edged sword. So the first obvious one is that there are two companies that are the big winners, okay? It's Microsoft and Amazon. They are the one booming. In part, so Amazon is because of the delivery system and also because of the cloud, and then same thing with Microsoft, okay? To a lesser extent, Google, and to a lesser extent, Apple and Facebook. So to some extent, then you can say, well, it looks like it's just going to reinforce the fact that these guys were already dominant firms. That is certainly true. On the other hand, we are using Zoom for this meeting. We are not using anything else. And there is a reason, because Zoom is better. And Zoom and Slack are going to be two very serious new competitors for the tech giants, okay? So if you thought that one of the barriers to entry in these markets was the ability to create a very big network very quickly, okay? Then the COVID crisis has solved that problem for Zoom and Slack. Their network is just as big as that of Facebook. So maybe, you know, we're gonna have new competitors. So there could be a silver lining here. The last trend is, I think, the more worrisome, which is the nationalism. And that's very much linked to China. I don't think I think it has a little bit to do with COVID, but I think in the big picture of things, it's gonna be China. And definitely in the US, it's very clear. In Europe, also to a large extent, I think it's true. Yeah, China being such a huge player and is a real issue for many reasons. It's unfortunately also something that is used as an excuse for lobbyists to justify bad policies. Okay, and the push for national champions that you hear in the US today almost always uses China as a scarecrow, you know, saying, look, if you don't let us merge and be dominant at home, then we won't be able to fight back against the Chinese giants. And I think it's important I think economists have a role to play there, because we should be there reminding people that this is 95% of the time, this is utter bullshit. Okay, this is not true. There's absolutely zero evidence that firms that you allow to merge at home become stronger competitors globally. In fact, usually it's the other way. The best way to have strong firms that can compete globally is to have a very competitive market at home, because then they get to train very hard at home and they are ready, fit, and efficient when they go abroad. Okay. Now there might be some exceptions, but by and large, I think that argument is bogus, but it's still used by the lobbyists. So I think the prime duty of economists then is to call their bluff.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Jeffrey Thomas. He's asking whether are we not all complicit in this great reversal, to the extent that we are in an aging society in which the state has withdrawn for public pension provision. Households necessarily engage in private pensions for income, and a large portion of private pensions is, of course, coming from dividends, distributed monopoly profits, if you wish. So we are all rentier now. Are we complicit? Is it fair or not? And I have to say, a lot of people like this question. We got a lot of hands up on this question.
I think it's a great question, and it's one of these where I wish I had a way of. I think it's a very good point. I wish I had a good way of testing it, but I can tell you that it's definitely possible. So if you think about, first, so let's start with let's do it in 2 steps. Imagine a world where everybody has the same mix of income, a mix of labor income and capital income. Okay, in that world, everybody would agree that competition is good, because essentially what they earn is GDP. And so they would agree that the first order of business would be increase the share of the pie, the size of the pie for everybody. The sharing of it doesn't matter so much. And there, everybody would be voting for policies that increase competition. Now, imagine a world in which some people get much, and let's make it simple, imagine some people get all of their income from capital income, and some people get all of their income from labor income. Well, then it becomes ambiguous. And in fact, you saw in my simulations that when I simulate the US economy under the competition that prevailed 20 years ago, total capital income goes down, actually. So if I'm a retired person earning capital income, I wouldn't vote for that. And of course, older people vote more than younger people. That's even more true in the US, where very few people vote. And so it is very possible that the people who vote the most don't really have an incentive to vote for high competition, because the dividend payment that they get more than compensate the high prices that they pay. You know, it's a race. Like you get a big fat dividend from AT&T and you get ripped off when you have a cell phone. The question is, you know, how do you compare these two? Well, if you're retired and maybe you don't need like a super fancy cell phone and you have a lot of stocks or dividend, then maybe you prefer AT&T to be a fat monopolist. And if you vote, then you're going to vote for that. Yes, that's a very good possibility.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's move on. A question from Duncan Clark. He's asking about big tech. You just cursorily mentioned, and
yes.
let me note also, you haven't spoken deliberately about the financial sector, even though you are a great expert on many of the issues there. So Duncan asks, COVID really has meant that we are now increasingly dependent on big tech. Does it mean that their power will increase? Does it mean that regulatory capture is unavoidable?
Well, unavoidable, hopefully not. And whether their power is going to increase or not, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I don't think we should be too pessimistic. I think the game is not over. So I think let's go step by step. So first of all, I think the big tech firms are all very different. Okay, there is a very different analysis of Google and Amazon, for instance. If you look at Amazon, they do have a lot of power. I think they do have too much power. On the other hand, you have to admit that they are so amazingly efficient that there is a reason why they are dominant. The way they could rearrange their supply chain, the way they could prioritize essential items so that people would still get the thing they really need by slowing down everything else, it's amazingly impressive. I mean, also, as far as I know, I might be wrong, but as far as I know, I don't think there is any evidence that any of the big stores that Amazon runs in the US that has a cluster, that's become a cluster of the COVID. At least I've never seen that anywhere in the news, which means that they managed to do that without putting their employees at risk in health-wise. So, you know, you got to give them credit for that. There's a reason why we use Amazon. It's because it just works. It just, when everything else is so inefficient. So I think that's, you know, now they do have too much power. So we need to find a solution for that. And that's going to involve a mixture of regulations and stuff like that. I also hope that perhaps some of the medium-sized businesses are going to realize that, home delivery is not that complicated, and they could do it as well, but they need to team up. Okay. I've seen that happening in France a lot, where we love markets, open air markets in France, and of course they were closed. So the people who used to go there, independent usually, like single person businesses, they started to team up to do home deliveries together. Well, they could have thought about that 10 years ago, to be honest. But at least, if they put that infrastructure in place, then they would be in a better place to compete. So I think that's clear. Now, the part which is more worrisome is the part about privacy, because it's clear that in the post-COVID world, we're going to have to give up some of the online privacy, and that might be exploited by other networks. So I think that's the part where I would be perhaps a little bit more pessimistic.
Excellent. Angelo, I want to call on you. Would you like to add to some of these questions?
Yeah, just on the last one, I think on big tech, I think a lot will depend on how these are financed, meaning as it is pretty clear, for instance, I give the example of the UK market for food delivery. There were, and there are mainly 3 players, Deliveroo, Just Eat, and Uber Eats. And Deliveroo has seen its margins being completely squeezed, also by some of the dynamics that Thomas was talking about, especially because you don't make much margins on food delivery, and also because it is costly to employ personnel, although the conditions are a bit questionable there. But you could see definitely that Uber, because of the backing of SoftBank and also Just Eat being in a different scenario, there the financing of it all matters, and that's why I had that slide on cash flows and liquidity, or even of these big companies, because the capital structure will matter a lot, whether whether the liquidity problem will translate into a solvency issue. The other problem, I think, it's also and we are having major issues in the EU, but I think in the world as a whole, with how do we tax how do we tax big tech, and unless we actually agree on some global competition standards also on taxation, then this will be one of the major issues moving forward, because it's also linked to the financing part, I think.
Excellent, thank you, Angelo. The questions keep coming in. Let me ask one which asks the question of the role of quantitative easing monetary policy. Alison Payne is asking whether the very low interest rates that we have been seeing and which are expected to continue have contributed to the possibility of higher profit margins and thus higher concentration. Professor Philippon.
Yeah, in theory it's possible. In theory it's possible. It's hard for me to imagine that this is quantitatively very, very large, but in theory it's possible. I think one way to think about it is, bank versus non-bank. If you can tap the bond market directly without going through a bank, then very low interest rates and QE really help you out. Okay. So I think that gives a boost to this, because if you go to the banking system, they still need to pay the intermediation margin of the banks. You can't squeeze that. They have to make a living as well. And so even if they lower the borrowing cost, they will never lower it as much as you could get by tapping directly the bond market. So when rates are very low, it is true that relatively speaking, it helps more the firms that can tap the bond market. And that gives them an incentive to issue more debt. Now, whether they use it to invest and take away the market share of the smaller ones or to pay dividends, that's another question. But in theory, it's possible, yeah.
Okay, excellent. There are quite a lot of questions about how to reverse this reversal, this great reversal. How to achieve in the US a reversal to a situation where competition is larger, when you reduce the market dominance, the bad concentration, as you put it, Professor Philippon. Can you give us a view of how you see this playing out? What would work really in the US? Would it Washington who would start these reforms? Would it be somewhere else? Is it Is it new business? What is your view?
Well, I think at this point, Washington is so dysfunctional that there's nothing to expect from Washington. You could hope that they don't screw it up, but that's the best you can hope for. At the state level, you can be a bit more optimistic. I think that if you step back and you think about the big picture, I would say that I would put the political economy front and center there. If you don't have some change in the political economy of the US, it's going to be hard to do anything that's sustainable. The first thing is you need to bring back some bipartisan support for these policies, because big changes in competition or even antitrust cases, they take years. So if the next administration only goal is to undo what the previous one was doing, this is never going to go anywhere. So it's not the case that the Democrats and the Republicans would ever agree on everything, but they should agree on at least a few big principles for free market and consumer welfare that they can then enforce. If you don't do that, then the lobbyists have a field day, because all they need to do is for their party to be in power, and then they do whatever they want. So I think some form of bipartisan support for competitive pro-competition policies, I think that would be step one. And this is the tradition in the US. I mean, there was a consensus for a long time. So I think I would bring that back. You also need to find a way to limit corporate contributions to campaign finance. It failed, of course, 10 years or 15 years ago. But that's the best thing you could hope for in Washington, some way of limiting campaign contributions. That has to go through the Supreme Court. So that's complicated, but that's kind of one thing. At the state level, things are much more open. At the state level, there is plenty of young Republican governors who are open to the idea that there's an issue with competition. In fact, many of them have started removing some licensing requirements at the state level that made no sense, and they are open to the idea that we need competition. They're also very open to the idea of going after the big tech, because the big tech are not that popular in many states. So I think there's more hope there. So my own view was that if I had to spend political capital, I would do it at the state level first, try to get the state AGs and the governors to team up, because Washington is so dysfunctional, at least until November. I think there's absolutely nothing to expect from Washington.
Thank you. Turning again to the European angle, we have a question from Vicky Price. As a result of the crisis, there is an increasing call for European champions in the economy and for onshoring of production and so on. Should we worry?
Well, yes and no. I think yes, because the national champions nonsense is something that Europeans love to do in the past, and they could fall back on their bad habits of the past. So that's always possible. But on the other hand, I think that we have much stronger, protections now thanks to the single market. Now, as Angelo was saying, of course, some of them are temporarily suspended and therefore are going to be abused, but it's going to be temporary. So I am not too worried. Yes, we're going to bail out the stupid airlines who should have restructured a long time ago. Sorry about that. Okay, I don't think that's the end of the world. I would not have done it that way. I think we should have made some kind of bridge loans for these banks. So sorry, for these companies, because of course we don't want them to go bankrupt just right now, because the courts are not even open. So clearly that's not the time. You give them a 6 months bridge loan, and then you put them to chapter bankruptcy in the fall, and then you clean up their stupid creditors and their assets, and then you reopen. Actually, you don't reopen. You keep running the airlines. I think that would have been better. Well, okay, we didn't do that. I think the onshoring discussion is very different. I am in favor of onshoring many of the things that's absolutely, but that's not competition, that's trade policy. And they are different. Like you can very much, I think we are relying too much. I mean, we saw it obviously in the case of health equipment, medical equipment, but there are many other industries you can make the case that we shouldn't be too dependent. At least we need to have the option to do some stuff on the European side. So that is more an issue of trade policy. So to me, the thing that I absolutely want to protect is the single market. The EU is big enough that if we free trade among ourselves, we're going to be just fine. Okay. What I absolutely want to avoid is to break the single market. Whether in the next 10 years we start putting barriers outside the EU, why not? I mean, we shouldn't be just like, naive players where the Chinese and the American do what they want. And no, that's not that. We can play that game too. So I don't think that the EU should necessarily be like a naive pro-free trade with the rest of the world, given that the rest of the world is not playing by the same rules. But within the EU, I still absolutely want to protect the single market. So to me, the danger is if we start touching that. Trade policy, I think we could be a bit tougher. I still believe free trade is better, and I think we should still work with the WTO. But if nobody else wants to do it, I think we should be ready to put, to have some other more aggressive policy on the trade side.
Thank you. Next question. There's actually a bouquet of questions about the impact of the increasing role of the state, more state intervention as a result of the COVID crisis. And we have a question from Irene from Greece. In that regard, do you expect that the states will be more interfering, and what does it mean for competition? We have a question for Matt, not exactly, but related. How should the EU respond to competition from Chinese state-owned enterprises? What is your view? And maybe we can put it a little bit more generally. We may see much more state-owned enterprises as a result of COVID. How you see this playing out in terms of competition and market concentration?
So are we going to see much more state-owned enterprises? Maybe a little bit. I don't think it's going to be as much. I think most of them are going to be like a debt program, subsidized or debt guarantees or either direct lending by the state, which doesn't change the ownership structure. So I don't think we necessarily are going to have. My main worry about COVID, to be honest, is not that. My main worry about really is we're going to kill too many small and medium businesses. That's by far, the priority should be make sure that the small and medium-sized businesses can survive and reopen. I think that's priority number one. If that means more support from the state, so be it. I don't think it's a big deal. It's temporary. It's fine. If we have to bail out a few big firms because we are worried about the knockdown effect or like some externality, that's also, I think I can live with that as well. So actually, I'm not that worried about it. I think that the single market is going to come back. I'm more worried about the political economy of COVID if the Europeans don't show that they can work together properly. So that I think that I'd be very worried about, much more so than the national champions. And China, yes, I agree, but that's different. That's trade policy. I think we have something called reciprocal agreements, which is if I open my markets to you, you should open your markets to me. Clearly, the Chinese are not playing by the rules of the game there, and the Europeans have been too weak to call it. And I think we should be more aggressive on that. Excellent.
A question from one of our LSE master students, Ruodi Lee. He's asking that one of the great graphs that you presented, total lobbying expenditures peaked in 2009 and 10, just after the global financial crisis. What is your prediction in the post-pandemic era? Would there be a decline? Well, let's hope. Would there be a new record, or what do you think? Lobbying, more lobbying, less lobbying?
I don't think the peak is in part a fluke of the fact that the data reporting has become weaker after 2010. Okay. I think there was a very big increase in banking lobbying post 2009, obviously, because of all the banking regulations happening. In recent years, the big increase in lobbying has been by the big tech. Okay, so that's going to continue. In the US, in Europe, I'm not sure that it's going to change that much. I mean, the airlines don't need to lobby the same way because it's called Air France. Okay, the name is in the title, so the way they lobby is saying, do you want Air France to go down? Lufthansa is the same, right? So it's not the same. I don't think it's going to go through the same channel. But on that front, let me just, one thing that's important to keep in mind is there is virtue in having global companies and regulators in different regions. And just, I think everybody should keep in mind two examples. Google and Volkswagen, okay? if it was not thanks to a bunch of kids in some NGO in the US, we would still be killing ourselves with diesels in Europe, okay? Because the regulators in Europe were utterly corrupt, okay? It was pure corruption, 100% corruption by the car industry to prevent the release of the data that diesel was bad, okay? And they were cheating like crazy on all the tests. This was found out first by some NGO and then by the California regulator. Thanks to them, we're gonna save lives in Europe, okay? That's what happened. On the other hand, think about Google. Google lobbied so hard in Washington that nobody tried to do anything against them. The only people who tried to do something against them were in Brussels because they were not corrupt to the same extent because Google didn't have the same influence there. And now the Americans, if and when they decide to do something with respect to big tech, can learn from European experience. The same thing with data protection, okay? When we did the data protection initiative in Europe, the Americans made fun of us, okay? 2 years later, they copied it in California. So that's one thing where clearly there's a great value in having some outside regulators who are not influenced by your own companies, and we both benefit from it.
Great. We haven't named the baby in this lecture too much or at all, inequality. What does this whole great reversal means for inequality in the US?
Well, it increases capital income, and first of all, it decreases the pie for everybody. But clearly, as we discussed earlier, it's much worse for people who earn labor. So if you think about why is it that, it's not the only reason, but if you think about why is it that the middle class in the US feels squeezed out, it's because they are squeezed out by high prices. I mean, if you pay, just remember, the numbers are staggering. If you want broadband connection in Washington, D.C., you have Comcast, they're going to charge you more than $100 per month. Same thing with your cell phone. So if you're a taxi driver in Washington, D.C., you start the month with $250 of telecom bills just to get a cell phone and an internet connection, right? This is the numbers we're talking about. It's not small potatoes. So no wonder these guys feel like they are being ripped off and their standards of living are not increasing. Now, to be honest, though, the elephant in the room there in the US is the healthcare system. So clearly the healthcare system in the US is the biggest tax on labor and on the middle class ever engineered by mankind. I mean, this is 10% of GDP of pure waste. Maybe, okay, say 8% of GDP, right? Even in the, so France, Germany, countries that spend a lot on healthcare, we are around 10, 11% of GDP. The US is close to 20. A full 8% of it is rents, okay? That's a gigantic amount of money. It's a huge tax on labor and on the middle class. Of course, people who earn dividend income are very happy because all these big pharma and hospitals, they all pay large dividends and wages of doctors, but that's a ripoff. So that's where the meat is, okay? And if you could do something about that, that would have a massive impact on inequality, obviously.
Piroska, just to add
yes,
on this.
Just Angelo, 1 second. We are very mindful of the time.
Yeah.
Just yes, we have to be.
Then I'll
you.
just close by saying actually that actually COVID in a way exacerbates all of these because we thought that it would be a great leveler of inequalities. That the first evidence shows actually the complete opposite.
Excellent. There are so many good questions, excellent questions. One that I couldn't ask because I think it will require a new book from you, Professor Philippon, is how do you think about these things in the context of developing countries to the extent the data allows this analysis? But we have to close, unfortunately. I want to thank so much Professor Philippon for his time. We know that you are very busy, and we are very grateful that that you took the time to be with us. Also, Angelo Martelli, thank you, Angelo, for your insightful comments, and thank you all of you around the globe, really, to have participated in our discussion. Those who haven't received answers to their questions, I can tell you, just buy the book on Amazon, of course, is the easiest these days.
You can order it from your local bookstore.
Yes. Well, I did. I got it on Kindle. It's great, we of course will be having more of these seminars. Tomorrow we will have a joint seminar with CPR on India's COVID response. We hope that many of you will be able to join us. And again, Professor Philippon, next time we hope to not only virtually but in person to see you in London at the LSE. Thank you so much in the name of all of us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Angelo.
Very much.
Thank you, Piroska. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.